April 18th, 1945, 10:47 hours. Bombed schoolhouse ruins, southern Okinawa. Private First Class Charlie Wilson from West Virginia crawled through the rubble, ignoring the sniper fire that had been cracking overhead for the past hour. His squad had taken cover behind the collapsed walls of what had been an elementary school, but Wilson had spotted something that made him forget about tactical safety. A small Japanese girl, maybe 4 years old, crouched behind a pile of broken concrete, crying silently as she clutched an empty rice bowl. The child was so thin, her ribs showed through her torn dress. Her feet were bare and bloody, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She had probably been hiding in these ruins for days, maybe weeks, surviving on whatever scraps she could find while the battle raged around her. Wilson looked back at his sergeant, who was signaling frantically for him to return to cover. Then he looked at the girl again, pulled a K-ration from his pack, and continued crawling forward despite the bullets singing past his helmet. "Hey there, sweetheart," he whispered in English she couldn't understand, but his tone was gentle as he placed the canned meat and crackers beside her bowl. When she looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, he smiled and offered her a piece of chocolate from his own emergency rations. For Japanese civilians who had been conditioned to expect slaughter from American demons, the most shocking revelation came not from witnessing military power, but from watching enemy soldiers risk their own lives to place food in the hands of starving children who belonged to the very people trying to kill them. The propaganda of terror. Japanese civilian conditioning had been systematic and thorough, designed to prevent any cooperation with American forces and ensure that resistance continued even after military defeat became inevitable. Radio broadcasts, government announcements, and community meetings had spent months painting Americans as subhuman monsters who delighted in torturing children and slaughtering innocents. The propaganda emphasized racial hatred and portrayed Americans as mixed-race barbarians who possessed no honor, mercy, or normal human emotions. Children learned songs about brave Japanese who chose death over falling into enemy hands. School lessons taught that Americans killed babies for sport and fed on human flesh like wild animals. Military authorities distributed weapons to civilian communities with instructions for killing their own children rather than allowing them to be captured by forces that would torture them slowly for entertainment. Families were ordered to commit mass suicide when American troops approached, with poison and explosives provided specifically for this purpose. The psychological conditioning was so complete that many civilians genuinely believed death was preferable to contact with Americans who represented everything evil in their understanding of the world. When American forces approached Japanese communities, mothers often tried to kill their own children rather than let them fall into enemy hands. The starvation reality. By the spring of 1945, civilian populations throughout Japanese-controlled territories were facing systematic starvation, as military authorities commandeered all available food supplies for combat troops. Children were particularly vulnerable to malnutrition that quickly became life-threatening in the chaos of combat operations. Okinawan children had been reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and whatever insects they could catch while hiding in caves and bombed buildings. Many hadn't seen rice, meat, or vegetables for weeks. The sight of American K-rations, canned beef, crackers, chocolate, and fruit represented abundance beyond their comprehension. Military rations that American soldiers complained about constantly provided more nutrition than Japanese children had received in months. A single K-ration contained more calories than many families had consumed in days, while the chocolate and canned fruit were luxuries that most children had never experienced. The medical consequences of prolonged starvation were visible throughout civilian populations. Children developed distended bellies from kwashiorkor, while their arms and legs wasted to skeletal proportions. Many were too weak to cry, sitting in silence while their bodies slowly consumed themselves. The first encounters. The initial contact between American soldiers and starving Japanese children occurred throughout April and May 1945, as combat operations moved through populated areas where families had been unable to evacuate before fighting began. These encounters consistently shocked American personnel who had been prepared for military resistance but not for discovering dying children in the wreckage. Corporal Bobby Martinez from San Antonio discovered 3 children hiding in a bombed temple on April 20th. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 8, was trying to care for 2 younger siblings who were obviously dying from malnutrition and dehydration. Martinez immediately called for medical attention while sharing his own rations with children who were too weak to chew solid food. "They just stared at us," Martinez wrote to his wife. "Not scared, not angry, just empty, like they'd forgotten what it meant to be alive. When I gave them water, they drank like they'd never seen liquid before. The little one couldn't even hold the cup steady." Medical personnel who examined these children discovered malnutrition so severe that normal feeding could prove fatal. Severely malnourished children required careful refeeding with diluted liquids and soft foods to prevent digestive complications that could kill patients whose systems had adapted to starvation conditions. The dangerous compassion. Feeding Japanese children often required American soldiers to expose themselves to enemy fire, while making themselves vulnerable to attack from Japanese forces, who viewed such contact as collaboration with the enemy. Many acts of kindness toward children occurred under conditions where showing mercy could prove fatal. The tactical situation on Okinawa made any exposure dangerous, with Japanese snipers and artillery observers maintaining constant surveillance of American positions. Soldiers who left cover to approach civilians risked being shot by defenders who would kill anyone cooperating with enemy forces. Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson from Oregon violated direct orders when he crawled across open ground to reach a group of children trapped in a damaged building. Sniper fire followed his movement, but he continued forward to deliver food and water to kids who hadn't eaten in days. His squad provided covering fire while he made multiple trips to evacuate the children to safety. "I couldn't leave them there," Thompson explained to his commanding officer, who was considering disciplinary action. "They were just babies. If we can't help kids, what the hell are we fighting for?" The barbed wire Mercy civilian internment camps created particularly poignant situations where American guards found themselves feeding children through barbed wire fences that separated them from families who had been conditioned to expect brutality. The camps were supposed to provide protection for displaced civilians, but resources were limited and children were often hungry. The guards at these facilities were typically combat veterans who had been assigned to security duties after being wounded or exhausted by frontline service. Many found themselves more affected by the sight of hungry children than they had been by combat casualties. Private First Class Eddie Rodriguez from Los Angeles began sharing his rations with children in the camp where he was assigned guard duty. His actions started a pattern among other guards who found ways to supplement official food distributions with their own supplies, despite regulations that prohibited fraternization with internees. "The kids would come to the fence every day," Rodriguez recalled. "They didn't say anything, just looked at you with those big eyes. You'd hand them a piece of chocolate through the wire, and they'd hold it like it was gold." Some of them had never seen candy before. The cave children. The discovery of children hiding in Okinawan cave systems created some of the most dangerous rescue situations American forces encountered. These children were often alone, their parents having been killed or separated during combat operations. Approaching cave systems required extreme caution because they might contain armed defenders or booby traps. American forces developed specialized techniques for coaxing children out of caves without triggering violent responses from adults who might be hiding with them. Teams included Japanese-speaking personnel who could call reassurances while approaching slowly with food and medical supplies visible. The children who emerged from caves were often in critical condition from prolonged exposure, dehydration, and starvation. Many had been living on rainwater and whatever organic matter they could find in the darkness. Their physical condition shocked medical personnel who had treated combat casualties but never seen such systematic malnutrition. Corpsman James Sullivan discovered a brother and sister, ages approximately 5 and 7, who had been living alone in a cave system for over 2 weeks. Their parents had been killed during artillery bombardment, leaving the children to survive on their own, in conditions that would have challenged adult survival experts. The language of kindness, communication barriers between American soldiers and Japanese children created opportunities for demonstrating kindness through actions rather than words. Simple gestures, offering food, providing water, gentle treatment of injuries, communicated humanitarian intent that transcended linguistic differences. Many American soldiers learned basic Japanese phrases specifically for interacting with children. Daijobu, it's okay, tabete, eat, mizu, water. These simple words, spoken gently by foreign soldiers, often provided the first evidence that Americans possessed normal human emotions rather than demonic cruelty. The children's responses to kindness often surprised American personnel who had been conditioned by their own propaganda to expect fanatical resistance from all Japanese people. Instead, they found children who responded to gentle treatment with the same trust and gratitude that American children would show. The universal language of childhood, smiles, tears, hunger, fear, created emotional connections that transcended national boundaries and racial differences. American soldiers discovered that Japanese children played the same games, liked the same treats, and needed the same comfort that their own children required. The medical intervention. American medical personnel treating Japanese children discovered conditions that exceeded anything they had encountered during military campaigns focused on combat casualties. The systematic malnutrition and neglect required specialized medical knowledge that most combat medics had never needed to develop. Severe malnutrition created medical emergencies that required immediate intervention to prevent death from refeeding syndrome and other complications. Children who had been starving for weeks couldn't safely consume normal food quantities without careful medical supervision that monitored electrolyte balance and digestive function. Navy Corpsman David Chen had trained for battlefield medicine, not pediatric nutrition, but found himself caring for dozens of severely malnourished children who required expertise he didn't possess. His improvised treatment protocols, developed through trial and error, saved lives while demonstrating American commitment to civilian welfare. "We were making it up as we went along," Chen documented in his medical notes. "These kids needed specialized treatment we didn't have, but we couldn't just let them die. We shared our rations, diluted our medicine, and did whatever we could to keep them alive." The chocolate diplomacy. American chocolate became a powerful tool for building trust with Japanese children who had never experienced such concentrated sweetness. Hershey bars, included in K rations as morale boosters for American troops, became diplomatic gifts that created positive associations with American presence. The children's reactions to chocolate often moved American soldiers more than combat victories had. Kids who had been listless and withdrawn suddenly showed energy and curiosity when they tasted sugar for the first time in months. Their smiles became precious rewards for soldiers who had seen too much death and destruction. The sharing of chocolate created moments of pure joy that transcended the horror of combat operations. American soldiers discovered that making a child smile felt more meaningful than tactical victories, while Japanese children learned that enemies could provide pleasure rather than just pain. Private Tommy Kowalski from Detroit always saved his chocolate ration for children he encountered during patrols. "Combat was about killing people," he wrote in his diary. "Giving kids chocolate was about keeping them alive. I knew which one mattered more, s'mores." The family transformations. Japanese families who witnessed American soldiers risking their lives to feed their children experienced psychological transformations that challenged fundamental assumptions about enemy character and war itself. The evidence of their own experience contradicted years of propaganda conditioning about American brutality. Mothers who had prepared to kill their children rather than allow American capture instead found themselves accepting food from soldiers who showed more concern for child welfare than Japanese military authorities had demonstrated. This reversal of expectations created cognitive dissonance that forced re-evaluation of basic beliefs. The gratitude that developed among families who received American assistance often extended to broader acceptance of occupation policies and reconstruction efforts. Personal experiences of American kindness provided emotional foundations for political cooperation that exceeded what formal negotiations could achieve. Children who had been fed by American soldiers often became interpreters and cultural bridges who helped their families navigate the complexities of occupation while maintaining positive attitudes toward former enemies who had saved their lives. The strategic impact. The humanitarian treatment of Japanese children achieved strategic objectives that military force alone couldn't accomplish. Civilian populations that experienced American kindness became less likely to support continued resistance while more willing to cooperate with occupation authorities. Intelligence gathered from grateful families often proved more valuable than information obtained through interrogation of military prisoners. Parents whose children had been saved by American soldiers provided willing cooperation that included information about military positions, supply caches, and resistance activities. The psychological warfare impact of feeding children exceeded formal propaganda programs because it was based on direct personal experience rather than abstract political messages. Families that benefited from American assistance became credible advocates for cooperation within their communities. International observers who learned about American treatment of Japanese children gained evidence of democratic values that supported diplomatic efforts to build post-war alliances. The demonstration of mercy toward enemy children provided moral authority that enhanced American leadership during Reconstruction. The moral authority. The systematic kindness shown by American soldiers toward Japanese children established moral authority that influenced American leadership during the post-war Reconstruction period. The demonstration of democratic values under extreme conditions provided credible evidence of American character that supported diplomatic initiatives. Religious and humanitarian organizations that learned about American treatment of Japanese children became advocates for American policies and values during Reconstruction efforts. Their support provided moral validation that strengthened American influence in international affairs. The contrast between American treatment of enemy children and Axis treatment of civilian populations became powerful evidence of democratic superiority that supported American positions during international negotiations about post-war arrangements. The moral example set by individual soldiers created expectations about American behavior that influenced future policy decisions and international relationships. The reputation for showing mercy to children became part of American international identity during the Cold War period. The generational impact. Children who received food from American soldiers during combat operations often carried positive memories of these encounters throughout their lives, influencing their attitudes toward America and international relations for decades after the war ended. Many of these children became advocates for peaceful relations with the United States as adults, using their personal experiences to counter anti-American sentiment during various political crises. Their testimonies provided credible evidence of American character that influenced public opinion. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of families that received American assistance often learned family stories about enemy soldiers who risked their lives to save Japanese children. These oral traditions created positive associations with America that influenced multiple generations. Educational institutions in Japan often used stories of American kindness toward children to teach about international relations and the possibilities for peaceful conflict resolution between former enemies. The resistance to orders. Many instances of American soldiers feeding Japanese children occurred in direct violation of military orders that prohibited fraternization with enemy civilians. These acts of compassion required individual moral courage that transcended institutional regulations designed to maintain tactical security and prevent complications during combat operations. Field commanders often faced difficult decisions about how to respond to subordinates who violated orders to help starving children. Formal discipline conflicted with recognition that humanitarian impulses represented the values that democratic societies claimed to defend during wartime. Captain Robert Hayes commanded a company that had suffered significant casualties during cave-clearing operations on Okinawa. When he discovered that several of his men were sharing rations with Japanese children despite explicit orders against civilian contact, he faced a command crisis that tested his understanding of military duty. "I could court-martial half my company for disobeying orders," Hayes wrote in his official report. "But these men were risking their lives to feed starving kids. How do you punish soldiers for being too human? These are the values we're supposed to be fighting for." The informal policy that developed in many units allowed humanitarian assistance while maintaining official disapproval that satisfied higher command requirements. Squad leaders often looked the other way when soldiers shared food with children, creating unofficial tolerance for compassionate violations of military regulations. The psychological warfare impact. The sight of American soldiers feeding Japanese children created psychological warfare effects that exceeded anything achieved through formal propaganda programs. The evidence of enemy kindness spread through civilian populations faster than military communications could counter or control. Japanese civilians who witnessed American humanitarian assistance became advocates for cooperation within their communities, providing testimonials about enemy character that contradicted official propaganda more effectively than any formal psychological operations campaign could achieve. The credibility of eyewitness accounts from trusted community members made American humanitarian conduct more persuasive than radio broadcasts or leaflet drops that civilians could dismiss as enemy deception. Personal observation of soldiers risking their lives to feed children provided evidence that couldn't be explained away by propaganda narratives. Intelligence reports documented the spread of positive stories about American conduct through civilian networks that Japanese authorities couldn't monitor or control. The informal communication created underground support for cooperation that undermined resistance efforts. The Medical Innovation Navy Corpsman Michael O'Brien developed feeding schedules and nutrition formulas specifically for Japanese children who had been surviving on grass and bark for weeks. His improvised protocols saved dozens of lives while creating medical knowledge that was later incorporated into military medical training. "We were learning as we went," O'Brien documented in his medical journals. "These kids needed specialized care we'd never been trained for, but we couldn't let them die while we waited for proper medical supplies. We made up treatments using whatever we had." The success of improvised medical care demonstrated the importance of field innovation and adaptive thinking in humanitarian operations. Military medical training was subsequently modified to include scenarios involving civilian malnutrition and pediatric emergency care under resource-constrained conditions. The supply chain sacrifice. American soldiers who shared their rations with Japanese children often went without adequate food themselves, creating personal sacrifice that exceeded military duty requirements. The systematic sharing of limited supplies demonstrated individual commitment to humanitarian values that transcended self-preservation instincts. K-rations were calculated to provide minimum nutrition for combat soldiers under extreme physical stress. Sharing these already limited supplies with civilians meant accepting personal hunger and reduced physical capability during operations where peak performance could determine survival. Staff Sergeant William Murphy documented his squad's food-sharing practices in letters to his wife. "We split our rations 3 ways now, 1/3 for us, 2/3 for the kids we keep finding. The men don't complain, but we're all losing weight. Nobody talks about it, but we all understand that feeding those children matters more than being comfortable." The willingness to accept personal hardship to help enemy children created unit cohesion that strengthened rather than weakened military effectiveness. Soldiers' 1945 currency. While medical supplies required precious shipping space and manufacturing capacity that could have been devoted to other military needs. The casual distribution of these resources to enemy children suggested abundance that Japanese military planners had never been able to achieve. The economic impact of American humanitarian assistance often exceeded the value of formal aid programs because it was delivered directly to those in greatest need, without bureaucratic overhead or political constraints. The efficiency of soldier-to-child distribution created maximum impact from available resources. Japanese families who received American assistance often became customers for American products during post-war reconstruction, creating economic relationships that benefited both countries while demonstrating the long-term value of wartime humanitarian investment. The enduring memory. In the end, Japanese civilians who were shocked when Americans risked their lives to feed their children discovered that enemies could become protectors when individual human compassion transcended national hatred and ideological conflict. The soldiers who chose to share their rations with starving enemy children proved that democratic values could survive the most extreme tests of warfare. The memory of these acts of kindness became more powerful than propaganda about enemy brutality because it was based on direct personal experience rather than abstract political conditioning. families that witnessed American soldiers risking death to place food in children's hands carried evidence that contradicted every assumption about enemy character. For the American soldiers who crawled through sniper fire to reach hungry children, the risk was worth taking because some things mattered more than tactical advantage or personal safety. They proved that strength could be measured not just by the ability to destroy enemies, but by the courage to preserve innocent life, even when that life belonged to the children of people trying to kill them. The Japanese, who shared common sacrifice for humanitarian purposes, developed stronger bonds that enhanced combat performance through increased mutual trust and shared commitment to unit values. Medical examinations of American personnel who participated in extensive food sharing revealed nutritional deficiencies that required supplementation and modified duty assignments. The physical cost of humanitarian assistance became measurable evidence of individual commitment to values that transcended military objectives. The command dilemma. American military commanders faced complex decisions about how to balance humanitarian impulses with tactical requirements when their troops consistently violated orders to assist Japanese children. The systematic nature of compassionate violations created command challenges that had no precedent in military doctrine. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commanding the 10th Army on Okinawa, received regular reports about soldiers sharing rations with enemy civilians, despite orders designed to prevent security breaches and maintain focus on combat objectives. His response revealed the tension between military necessity and humanitarian values. "I cannot officially condone violations of orders," Buckner wrote to his division commanders. "However, I will not punish soldiers for demonstrating the values that distinguish democratic armies from totalitarian forces. Use judgment. Maintain security. But remember that we are fighting to preserve civilization, not destroy it." Surinots. The unofficial policy guidance that emerged from such command decisions created flexibility that allowed humanitarian assistance while maintaining plausible deniability for higher authorities who needed to satisfy political and strategic requirements for military discipline. Battalion and company commanders developed informal protocols for managing humanitarian activities that satisfied both subordinate moral impulses and superior regulatory requirements. These compromises often involved creative interpretation of orders that technically prohibited fraternization, while allowing assistance that could be classified as security operations. The economic dimension. The food and medical supplies that American forces provided to Japanese children represented significant economic value that exceeded purely humanitarian considerations. The systematic distribution of military resources to enemy civilians demonstrated economic capacity that impressed Japanese observers familiar with their own military's chronic shortages. K-rations cost approximately 75 cents each in 90s. Children who received chocolate from enemy hands grew up to become bridges between cultures that had seemed irreconcilably opposed. Their survival became testimony to the power of individual compassion over institutional hatred, providing proof that human beings could choose mercy over vengeance, even in warfare's darkest moments. The ultimate shock for Japanese civilians wasn't just that Americans would feed their children, but that these former enemies would risk everything to do so, proving that some forms of love were stronger than war, some values more powerful than victory, and some acts of kindness capable of transforming enemies into family across boundaries that had seemed absolute until the moment a soldier's hand reached through barbed wire to place bread in the palm of a hungry child.